From the studio's election yard here on primary day, March 3rd. So at the time we recorded this, results were still coming in. It's pretty late at night on the East Coast on primary day, March 3rd. We still don't have, as of the time of this recording, a final resolution in the Senate race in Texas on the Democratic side. We kind of have a resolution on the Republican side in the Senate race. We'll get into that in a little bit. A lot of very interesting results that are shaking out in Texas. So there were primaries also in North Carolina and Arkansas on the 3rd, as well as some special elections. Special elections, North Carolina and Arkansas, will be discussed in separate videos. This one, we are only talking about what's going on in Texas. So let's start with the Texas Senate race. I think this is the big one that most people are concerned with at this point. We'll start with the Democratic primary. So the graphic we have on the screen, this is based off of 67% of the polls reporting, at least an estimated 67% of the expected vote counted. And James Talarico, the state representative, had 51.5%. Jasmine Crockett, the congresswoman from the Dallas area, had about 47%. And then you had Ahmad Hassan, a minor candidate, with about 1.3. Talarico was up about 68,500 votes, or about 4.3%. So there was a time earlier in the election night when Talarico was behind Crockett, and then Talarico started getting some big counties on the board where he did well. Very clear that he was doing well with the Hispanic vote, doing well in South Texas, and then also in Bexar County and in his home base of Travis County. So he took the lead. And there was a big issue in Dallas County where voters were being turned away, and then polling hours got extended, and then another court stepped in and stopped that from happening, so those ballots might not count. There's a whole mess going on in Dallas County right now. We'll have to see how that shakes out. If the races end up being close, that could really be an issue. As of right now, as of the time we made this video, the Democratic Senate primary still isn't quite that close yet. Now, if Talarico were to drop another 2 points, Crockett were to rise another 2 points, well, neither gets to 50%, then it would go to a runoff. So Talarico obviously hoping that he can just stay above 50%, get the nomination right here, and end it. Obviously, Crockett, you look at the early vote in Dallas County, her home base, it really was not as strong for her, not nearly as strong for her as she would have liked. She did whittle the gap down somewhat. She was about 10 points behind Talarico at one point, but it might just be too much to overcome. We'll have more clarity in the next day or so. But as of right now, Talarico is in the lead. He might very well be on his way to winning this primary. We will circle back with further results. And if you want the latest commentary from us, go to our Blue Sky account at electionyard.com. That is where we do most of our live commentary. We were commenting on this race and other races on primary day all night. So that's the situation in the Democratic primary. On the Republican side, you have an incumbent U.S. Senator John Cornyn who is going to be facing a runoff. So on the screen right now, we have the Republican Senate results. This was as of 70% of the expected vote counted. So John Cornyn was in the lead ahead of Ken Paxton. A lot of opinion polls had suggested that maybe Paxton would end up winning. He might still. There's still about 30% of the vote out, at least according to our data. He was behind Cornyn by about 26,500 votes, about 1.7%. Wesley Hunt, there were some opinion polls that had him doing better than he ended up doing. What appears to have happened, and I'm not terribly surprised, is that some Hunt voters ended up picking either Cornyn or Paxton, but it doesn't look like either one's going to come anywhere near 50%. So what does that mean? Even though we don't have the final numbers in this race yet, it's very clear that this is going to a runoff. And that means that you got another 2.5 months of this, because that runoff is not until around Memorial Day, May 26th. It is March 3rd. So it's closer to 3 months until the runoff. I don't know why Texas has such a long period in between the primary and the runoff, but it's going to be over 2.5 months until the Republican Senate nomination in Texas is decided. So let's take a step back on the Texas race for a minute. So right now, as of late at night on the East Coast on the 3rd, you got Talarico in the lead. Not going to exactly call him the winner yet, but he's in the lead. Then on the Republican side, you got Paxton and Cornyn go into a runoff, and I'm sure it will be a brutal runoff. If you heard some of the things that Cornyn was saying about Ken Paxton, then yeah, you know that it's going to be a pretty brutal runoff. So if you're the Democrats, you're looking at this situation in Texas right now, and you're saying, this might be our best chance at flipping a seat in Texas in a long time. Maybe even better than 2018. Because, I mean, look, I was following that race in 2018. In my gut, I never really thought that Beto O'Rourke was going to beat Ted Cruz. And when the results showed, it was a close race. It was like 51-48, something like that. I was actually surprised how close it was, because I didn't really think Beto O'Rourke was going to win that race. And he didn't. So the conventional wisdom at this point is that a Cornyn-Paxton runoff is going to result in Paxton winning the Republican nomination. There hasn't been a ton of polling on a Cornyn versus Paxton head-to-head yet, but the conventional wisdom at this point is that Paxton would probably win. If you have a Talarico versus Paxton race, in what could very well be, as we are seeing more and more signs develop every election night, more and more signs that it could very well be a good Democratic year. The signs, the factors, the perfect storm is starting to come together a little bit here. So remember, though, we are still 8 months away from the general election in Texas and everywhere else in the United States. But with that said, if I were the Democrats in Texas, I would feel like things were starting to come together a little bit. Like they might actually be able to do something with this situation. Because there was hypothetical polling that had come out during the primary campaign, testing different Democrats against different Republicans. And the most favorable combination to the Democrats was Talarico versus Paxton. There was a recent poll that came out maybe a week or two ago. I forget which pollster it was, but it tested that matchup, and it had Talarico 3 points up on Paxton, whereas the Republican won every other race combination, including Talarico against Cornyn. So things could get really interesting in Texas. Expect the runoff for the Senate to get really, really nasty. Some other statewide results very quickly in Texas. So obviously, Greg Abbott, the Republican governor, he has won his nomination with ease. Gina Hinojosa will be the Democratic nominee for governor in Texas. Dan Patrick, the Republican lieutenant governor, he's on his way. The attorney general's race was interesting because I saw a poll only a couple of days ago that suggested that Chip Roy, the congressman, was in first place, but that the race might go to a runoff. Well, it is going to go to a runoff, but Chip Roy definitely did not come in first in the primary. In fact, Chip Roy wasn't anywhere near first place in the primary. So Mays Middleton came in first place in the primary. Still a good amount of the vote left to go, but he's at about 43%. Chip Roy's at about 29%, and then you got some other candidates scattering the vote there. So Middleton and Roy are advancing to the runoff. Be very interesting to see what ends up happening there, because I think people just kind of expected that, Chip Roy has not only been a congressman for a while, but has gotten some national recognition. He's been on the cable news channels and whatnot. So I think people just kind of expected that Roy would do better than he did. So who knows? Maybe he won't win that runoff, but we're going to have to wait till the end of May to find out. Now, there are a handful of really interesting races going on in Texas at the U.S. House level. So let's talk about the 2nd District. This is in the Houston area, the general Houston area. So Dan Crenshaw is the Republican congressman here. He's been in Congress for a little bit. He was facing a primary challenge from his right, by a guy named Steve Toth, a state representative out there in Texas, and it looks like Toth has taken down Crenshaw. The race hasn't been called as of the time that we made this video, but Toth was at about 57% of the vote, and Crenshaw was only at 39%. So it really does look like Toth will win the Republican nomination there, and Crenshaw will go down to defeat. He will leave Congress at the beginning of next year. Again, the race hasn't been called yet, but a Republican incumbent really is kind of going down in flames if you look at the numbers, losing by about 18 points. That's a pretty substantial defeat. Let's now also talk about the 23rd. This was one we talked about on election morning, which hopefully will become a regular new thing that we do on election mornings. So Tony Gonzalez, he is a Republican congressman. This is predominantly a West Texas district. It stretches from the El Paso area out into the San Antonio area, gets areas like the Big Bend of Texas, and lots of wide open counties in West Texas along I-10 are in this district. But Tony Gonzalez, Republican congressman, involved in a scandal. He has denied the allegations, but it has been a particularly nasty scandal that has gotten national attention. But even at that, he still finished first in his primary, or so it would seem. He's at about 44%. Brandon Herrera, a conservative YouTuber, is at 41%. They are almost certainly going to go to a runoff. When that happens, the Republicans in that district are going to have a really interesting choice. So either they're going to go with a guy who is a pretty conservative, not sure whether or not he's quote unquote too conservative for the district. I guess we'll just have to find out in November. Or you got Tony Gonzalez, who is a scandal-ridden incumbent. So that's an interesting choice the Republican voters there are going to have to make. Almost like under the right circumstances, given that it's not a heavily Republican district. It's a red seat, but it's not a super red seat. Under the right circumstances, you could be giving a gift to the Democrats here, but we will just have to see how that plays out. Another race I want to talk about is the 18th District of Texas. This is one where you have two incumbent Democrats in the Houston area running against each other. So Christian Menefee, who was literally just elected in a special election recently, he is in first place in this primary right now against Congressman Al Green, who is a longtime congressman from this area. You may remember he was the congressman who got kicked out of the State of the Union recently. So Menefee is leading Green at this point, about 48 to 44%. It looks like most of the vote is in here, if not all of it at this point. So that one looks like, unless there's some ballots hanging out there that still haven't been counted, it looks like this one might be going to a runoff. Amanda Edwards, another Democrat, took just enough of the vote, it seems, to force this one into a runoff. So very interesting there. You got two incumbents running. But now let's flip to another race in which you have a current incumbent and a former member of Congress running against each other in a primary. This was the 33rd District of Texas. So this is up in the Dallas area. Colin Allred, former congressman, ran for Senate in 2024 and lost. He is trying to make a congressional comeback. He's at 45%. It seemed from the chatter going on that the momentum was starting to switch to Julie Johnson, who is a current member of Congress, but it seems like Allred is out in front here, but this one too might also be going to a runoff. We don't know yet. There's about 65% of the vote in here. Allred's at 45%. Julie Johnson is at 34%, and then there's another candidate, Carlos Quintanilla, who's at about 12%. So that's a nice margin for Allred. I'm sure he'll take it, but this one too might be going to a runoff. So what we've already established is that there might be some really, really interesting runoffs that we have to talk about in Texas when we come up on May 26th. Not only the Senate race, but in a number of House races and potentially also some other statewide races like the Attorney General's race. But one thing that I think as we wrap this up that would be encouraging for Democrats at this point is the Democratic turnout for this primary was very good. We were tracking some of the early votes on both the Republican and the Democratic side. And it looks like the Democrats are going to have a really strong turnout as I'm looking at the numbers as they're updating. About 1.6, almost 1.7 million Democratic votes have already been counted. That's more than Republican votes that have been counted at this point. And we're talking about Texas here, at a state where both parties had competitive primaries. I think Democrats in general are just motivated to get out and vote at this point. Doesn't matter who they're voting for, they're just motivated to get out and vote. So we'll obviously have to keep an eye on the Senate race because that's going to be very interesting. And I'll put it to you this way too. The Democrats are in the really unfortunate situation for them of having to flip some seats in red states in order to take the majority back in November 2026. Texas ending up being a competitive race, whether it's Talarico versus Paxton or whatever. Texas ending up being competitive gives the Democrats a real opportunity to make the Senate map more competitive. So we will talk about North Carolina in another video, but Roy Cooper, officially the Democratic nominee there. I do think Roy Cooper is a slight favorite entering that general election campaign. So that's +1, but the Democrats need to be +3 more. So if we find ourselves in a situation where Texas is potentially one of those, then that makes the Senate map a little easier, but there's still some tough sledding for Democrats. But you know that if they genuinely had a chance to flip a Senate seat in Texas, they would be salivating at that opportunity. So this is still a TBD, but at the time we recorded this, Talarico looks like he's up about 5 points now in that Democratic primary. And we do know for sure the Republican race is going to a runoff. So Texas is giving us some electoral drama. So stick around at Election Yard, like and subscribe. Follow us on social media. We'll see you soon.